I think we can actually get started as more people come in, they can join us, but I don't want to waste any time at all. We have only 50 minutes and I want to make sure that we use it well. So it's my distinct pleasure and joy to introduce our speaker today, Madam Atsuko Toda, who is the Director for the Agriculture, Finance and Rural Development Department at the African Development Bank. Before joining AFDB, she used to work for IFAD, International Fund for Agricultural Development, and also the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. You have a bio in front of you, so I will not repeat what is captured there, but I just wanted to say a few words of this lady who is, done some amazing work. There's very few people that I know that have both the depth and breadth of working around agriculture in developing countries. In terms of breadth, Atsuko has worked in several countries in South and East Asia, including Bangladesh, Nepal, Laos, Vietnam, and she moved to Africa. She moved to Africa in 2012 as IFAD country manager for Nigeria before she joined the African Development Bank. Currently, her work in the bank spans the entire continent. There's almost no corner of Africa she has not been to. In terms of the depth of her work, she started off working in rural communities and developing solutions for smallholder farmers, both in Asia and in Africa. And now she's working with some of the world's largest multinational agribusiness firms that are investing in projects to transform agriculture in Africa. There's very few people that I know that are as comfortable sharing stories with women under a tree in remote villages as they are in the highest boardrooms of multi-million dollar companies making strategic investments there. Atsuko holds a bachelor's degree in sociology from Doshisha University in Japan and a diploma in development studies from Cambridge University and a master's degree in public administration from International Christian University in Tokyo. She's a good friend and she's passionate about what she does, and I'm looking forward to hearing her remarks on how the transformation of agriculture in Africa. So with that, I will give it over to Madam Atsuko Toda, and we're waiting to hear your remarks. Thank you very much, Atsuko.
Thanks a lot, Ed. Thank you for that very generous introduction. And I must say it's a great honor today to be speaking to all of you. For me, when I hear Cornell, I just think about all the places I've been where I've met people from Cornell. So I really do believe that Cornell influences development thinking around the world in so many international organizations and in different countries. And the fact that I can have the opportunity to speak to students who have their whole careers in front of them, not so much just to talk about solutions, but really to frame some really important questions. It's such an honor and a pleasure, and I'm really grateful for this. I just wanted to say a couple of words before we start about how I came here. As Ed mentioned, I used to work in Asia, and I was still in development, and I learned a lot there. So when the opportunity came to me to work in Africa, I really jumped into it because I thought I could really learn more, and I wasn't wrong. I've spent a lot, my first country was Nigeria, and I spent a lot of time on learning lessons that I felt I had learned in development, but really around listening and learning from people. And I believe when we think about the African continent, it is about the people of Africa. There's tremendous capacity, tremendous innovation, and tremendous opportunity here. And so I look forward to kind of speaking about that as we go through the presentation. I understand that some of you actually get credits for listening to me today. So there's a number of questions that I'm going to pose to you. I would be so grateful if you don't feel like raising your hand, if you could just use the chat box to give me insight into into what you might think are some of the answers. And please feel free to use the chat box. And your answers will give me a lot of feedback and also the opportunity to kind of do the conversation. So with that, I'm going to share my screen if I can. And I've practiced this many times, so I think I can. Please tell me if you see my screen. No.
We see the one with Nurse Atsuko.
With, wait.
No.
Okay, let me try again. Okay, here we go. And this, how's this?
Still with notes on the side.
Oh, still with notes on the side, okay.
Yes, try that. Let's try this one more time.
Sorry, I practiced so much, maybe.
Yeah, we did practice this so much.
How's this?
Yes, voila.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so this is just the beginning, but please bear with me. We'll talk about the acceleration of the African agricultural transformation and the key role of the private sector. So let me go to the next slide. So before COVID, a number of African economies were actually enjoying growth. If you take, for example, Ethiopia, it had double-digit growth with high levels of foreign direct investment that were changing different sectors. But as you all know, as part of the global economy, African economies were also hit hard by the COVID crisis. And the fall in commodity prices, the measures to control the virus have really hit Africa hard. So it's a really good time to reassess the African food and nutrition security situation and think about where Africa is going. So I'd like to outline the conversation in these 4 parts: the African food and nutrition security situation, food markets and food supply chains, the importance of agro-industrialization, and then food for thought in a post-COVID Africa. So as you can see, the macroeconomic fundamentals are not good. Before COVID, they were, they were, as you can see, the green line, and then there were different scenarios. But what COVID has done is a number of things have happened. Number one, in the first quarter of 2020, there was an increased inflation on the continent. And this was, in the food and energy sectors, and much of it was attributed to delays and challenges in logistics. And this month in 2021, the Tony Blair Institute has reported that cereal prices have continued to increase globally, about 14% for maize, 9% for rice, 6% for wheat, and 6% for sugar. And why this is so bad is that when food prices increase, people who do not have purchasing power suffer the most. So that's why inflation is so critical. But overall, macroeconomically speaking, the decrease in commodity prices for African countries have curtailed foreign earnings. There have been currency depreciations, capital flight, decreased remittances, and an increasing debt that African governments have had to incur to finance fiscal and current account deficits. Unfortunately, foreign direct investment also has been hit very hard, and investors reduce or postpone their investments when there is uncertainty. So while economic recovery is projected globally and also for Africa, the situation continues to be particularly hard for African countries, as can be seen in this visual. The vaccine situation is slowly unrolling, but as you've probably heard in the news, for African countries or emerging countries, it's not as easy to get access. So on this slide, what we're trying to show is some of the global hotspots in 2020, the countries that are most risk of sliding further into crisis. Just to give you some background information, Africa has a population of 1.2 billion people. Of that, McKinsey reports 650 million people are facing food insecurity. That's 50%, 1 in every 2 persons facing food insecurity. So I think it's something that we really need to think about. And another 50% of that 50 are people who are labeled as already food insecure. So if you're in Africa, 1 in 4 persons is food insecure, i.e. hungry. Now, that should not be in a global world where global food of supply is ample. Following COVID-19, the extreme poverty rates in Africa have been projected to increase. And it is very unfortunate because in the absence of the pandemic, there was really a declining rate of poverty. However, due to the loss of formal jobs and due to the loss of opportunities of informal incomes, COVID is really reversing progress that was made in meeting the SDG targets. The point here is that for the food insecure population, the issue is not only the lack of purchasing power, but it is the fragility of the environment. The World Food Program has estimated the number of people globally classed as acutely food insecure is likely to be about 265 million people, and the majority of them are likely to be in Africa. So the situation in Africa is really something that we'd like to have all your thinking around. So my first question, for which I invite people to write into the chat, is the answers around food and nutrition insecurity in Africa. What can we do better? I know you've been looking at the situation, trying to understand it. What can we do better? We'd really like to kind of get your thoughts on that. So while we do that, I'd like to move to the next portion, i.e. food markets and food supply chains. When you look at the global food market, there have been a number of trends. Globally speaking, on the demand side, retail wholesale structures have changed in many, many markets. On the supply side, there is much more volume. Like I mentioned before, there is no reason why we should have food insecure people because there is much more volume in the global supply chains for food. There are many more supplying countries and many more firms. And also, another aspect that is changing is that the nature of products is changing, with products differentiating into commodities, value-added, and quality niches. The global food and beverages market grew from 6 trillion in 2019 to 8 trillion US dollars in 2020. So the compound annual growth rate is roughly about 3%. And I think it's important to remember these numbers. 3% growth rate, about 8 trillion US dollars. That's your global food and beverages market. And growth has in the global market been quite robust despite the economic slowdown across countries, despite COVID. Meanwhile, just in general, if you look at 3%, it's not extremely high. The growth in industrialized country food markets has been an overall trend of slowing down as the markets become saturated. The food retails sales were growing a little bit slower, or roughly around GDP. In these markets, it's much more competitive. There's cost competition as well as quality competition because they're big suppliers as part of the market chain. And also because in many more countries, whether it be Latin America, Asia, there's been large investments in infrastructure and productive capacity. So these countries have become much more competitive in terms of supplying to the world. Their shipping technology, packing tech, all of these things have greatly reduced transport costs. And therefore, there's much more competition for the global food markets. Now, let's take a look at African food markets. The revenue in African food markets is roughly about 750 billion in 2021, but it is projected to reach about 1 trillion in the next 5 years. The market is projected to grow at about 6% growth rate. So that's double what you see in the global markets. So where it stands today, at the global level, there is much more average per capita consumption compared to Africa, but it is growing fast given the growing population. It is expected that by 2050 on the African continent, there will be about 2.5 billion vis-a-vis the 1.2 billion that are living on the continent today. So as this population increases quickly, the demand for food is projected to rise by about 60% more than today's levels. The the upshot is that the fastest growth and thus major new opportunities in food trade will not be in the US and European markets, but growing in Asian and African food markets over the next 2 decades. There are opportunities that Africa must enhance its own competitiveness to catch these markets. Having said all of this, it's quite a strong picture of African food markets growing, population growing, demand growing. At the same time, we saw the food insecurity data, the 1 in 4 people being hungry. So I've always had to struggle between this issue of this amazing business opportunity, this great market that seems like it's such a place for private sector to grow, and then on the other hand, this growing food insecure population. I was looking into the data that's been provided by the Food Security Information Network, and you realize that there are populations still, particularly in transition states and in pockets of Africa, where basically these people just need food aid. According to these numbers, there are about 73 million people, notably in DRC, Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan. And so I think this is one thing, as we talk very positively about the growth of markets, that we need to continually have in mind. So the next part, I'd really like to break down the food market a little bit into, for Africa, the import sector, the export, and the intra-regional trade. I think it's very important to look at these topics separately. And so as you can see on the slide before you, you see that some of the top imported food commodities in Africa, we could only get the FAO stats from 2017, but you see what's being imported here, whether it be wheat, oil palm, rice, some important commodities. And I believe that there's a lot of conversation about Africa importing food. Taking from work that is done by Tom Reardon, we see that the FAO stats show in total about 850 million tons of food were consumed in sub-Saharan Africa in 2017. And of the total consumed amount, about 90% of the food was actually produced by African farmers and only 10% was imported. So when we actually look at the total amount of food that's consumed, the fact that only 10% was imported is something to look at. 60% of rice and most of the wheat are imported, but they form only 2.5% of all sub-Saharan food consumption in tonnage terms. I think that's very important to remember. An important conclusion would be that import substitution, while important, should not be a priority for policy. This, particularly as we need to keep markets open for processing and export. Next slide is more around exports. If we look at, compared to the 75 billion that Africa imports, Africa does not export as much. Total food exports, and this includes fish, was equal to about 46.5 billion US dollars. This includes cocoa, cashew, horticultural goods. And as you can see, the composition is very different. Whereas the import side was much more around rice, wheat. This is much more around export markets, commodities to US, European, and growing Asian markets. The industrialized countries are still the main food importers of these products in the world. And as I mentioned earlier, the competition is becoming more challenging as other countries like China and Latin America make it cheaper to supply from these countries. These exports include fruits, vegetables, and nuts from Morocco, Egypt, and South Africa, flowers from Kenya, fish from Morocco, cocoa from primarily Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. So there's certain pockets of exports that are moving out. As it's for here, I think the conclusion would be that for African countries to remain competitive, it's important to promote standards, ensure that transport infrastructure is put in place, including for logistics, cold chains, and storage. It's very important to export because of the competitiveness that's built around these export markets. Finally, and I think this is extremely interesting, it's more about the intra-regional trade. As you can see on this pie chart here, the intra-African food trade is roughly in total about 30 billion. In the long run, the main potential growth market will be in the African region for African countries as the middle class grows. It is important to note, meanwhile, that as 90% of food comes from domestic food supply chains, this surplus is pouring towards the cities in rapidly increasing quantities, and the rural-urban food supply chains have grown quickly, and the amount of African farmers that sell to consumers via supply chains is roughly about 80%. So the evidence points to the fact that domestic food supply chains are important, that intra-African trade will grow, and that wholesale markets and retail markets are vital pulse points of nearly all of the food economy. And I'd just like to show you a bit about what wholesale markets looks like. These are photos. Actually, Ed helped me to curate these photos. You can see these different retail wholesale markets. Mostly you see a lot of women, but this is where you have transporters coming together, traders coming together. A lot of supply moves through these wholesale markets. There's high post-harvest losses, and there's really a lot of room for improvement in sanitary conditions, but these are extremely important parts of the food supply chain in Africa. So as you saw in those wholesale markets, what's coming together is small, medium enterprises. So another important fact about domestic food supply chains in Africa is that there are just millions of micro, small, medium enterprises that are moving food from rural to urban areas. And in fact, in the African Agricultural Status Report, which is done by AGRA, the number of agri-SMEs operating in Africa rose 800% between 2000 and 2017. So you see that it's really a food supply chain which is dominated by these small, medium enterprises. Many of these smaller informal enterprises do not go to scale. Therefore, one of the challenges is cannot provide the necessary quantity to make food much more affordable in an efficient way to a greater number of people. But these SMEs create employment, they create purchasing power, and there are growingly a number of SMEs that have tested, tried, and proven solutions with very strong market access. The challenge is that despite the growth of SMEs, the local financial market is relatively unwilling to provide or finance these new enterprises. And so there is a challenge of going to scale. So my question number 2, and again, I ask everybody to use the chat box to give me kind of ideas. What can we do to accelerate the agricultural transformation? You saw the moving pieces, the import side, the export side, the massive domestic food supply chains, the number of how can we accelerate the agricultural transformation in order to provide nutritious food to more people? Would love to hear your answers. Sorry, I'm just going to continue on with the presentation. And so the next portion is about agro-industrialization. I'll talk about the bank for just 2 slides. The African Development Bank has a strategy which is called Feed Africa, and it's part of what we call the high fives, i.e. light up, empower Africa, industrialize Africa, integrate Africa, improve the quality of life for the people of Africa and feed Africa. So it's a very important pillar, and the agricultural transformation is something that lies very dear to our hearts. As you can see, really, it is about creating a competitive, inclusive sector that creates wealth, improves lives, and secures the environment. So there are a number of objectives, enablers, which I won't go into detail, but I'd be happy to answer questions later. With regards to the agro-industrialization portion, when it comes to structural transformation, and this is really something we'd really like to discuss with you, no country in the world has been able to move from low to middle to high income status without going through the process of agricultural modernization as the base for structural transformation. So it is critical, even for industrialization to happen. And the agricultural revolution is really a process of technological innovation and continuous diversification that requires a lot of investment. So in many African countries, the challenges of structural transformation include, number one, the lack of commercialization in the agricultural sector, the very high cost of logistics and lack of infrastructure, the industrial discipline and the low labor productivity, and really the business environment to enable the private sector to grow. Having said that, there are a number of interesting examples. If we look at Kenya, for example, the service sector in Kenya has grown to 60% of GDP on average over the last decade. Again, I was looking at a colleague's report on Uganda. There has been an increase in the share of industry from 20 to 30% and a doubling of manufacturing from 8 to 16% of GDP. So in a number of countries, this transformation is happening. But it is extremely important to prioritize agro-industrialization. It's particularly pertinent in the context of the post-COVID kind of resilient value chain conversation. Agri-food companies are becoming increasingly involved in local material procurement. And the upside about not just industrialization, but agro-industrialization is that there's huge opportunities for value creation, employment scale, not only at the point of the factory, but upstream, starting with the farmers, midstream, starting with all the lateral service providers, whether it be, what we were talking about earlier and what you saw in the markets, the traders, the warehouse providers, the wholesale marketeers. So there's a lot of room for employment. So that's one thing we'd like to bring up. The second thing is about building competitiveness of the domestic food supply chains. As you probably all know, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement means that, countries in Africa are looking at nearby markets and then looking to target those. African policymakers are eager to encourage new thinking, to promote enhanced productivity and new possibilities for growth, to be able to target nearby markets and a much more regional type of integration. Deriving from lessons from experience, what we're seeing is that industrial policies should be consistent with comparative advantage and the existing endowment structure. So we're really seeing that, whatever these governments want to do with regards to this new thinking around competitiveness, it's really important to look at the endowment structure that these countries have. Also, the business environment is the generic foundation for private sector and extremely important. And has been highlighted a number of times, logistics and infrastructure for free movement of food supply chains. And given the limited resources available, these investments must be concentrated in the most promising geographies and supply chains. And we'll come to that later when we talk about technology transfer. And here I'd like to make the case for large companies. I know that many development conversations around the need to pull up SMEs, but I think there's really a case in the context of Africa and on relatively weakly structured value chains to promote also large firms and to support them, because large firms create demand in their supply chains they grow markets of previously unavailable products and services. They introduce new technologies, improve workers' incomes and employment conditions. You know, I was looking at a World Bank study that looked at SMEs and large firms, and an interesting finding of that study was that SMEs are unlikely to transform into large firms in developing markets. The World Bank in this study found that all firms that enter with fewer than 20 employees and survive for at least 5 years, close to 89% remain small at the end of 5 years. So that's very interesting. So then the question becomes, which large firms and how do you actually support them? Large firms are driven by different ambitions. If you talk to large companies, they usually have huge market share targets, and growth is their main ambition. So, you know, strengthening these firms to be able to, you know, grow in an era of rapidly changing markets also is extremely important. So the problem actually is not really in the productivity performance of these large firms, but it's the ability to generate employment opportunities, and that's something that we'll need to look at more closely. And then I'm just going to speed up a little bit because I do want to leave time for questions. Within any country, there is enormous scope for you know, learning, but focusing on infant industries and more action to be able to take advantage of technology transfer. The African Development Bank invests in special agro-industrial processing zones. These are actually, as you see in the slide, a hub and spokes type of model whereby in different rural areas where there is a marketable surplus, we try to introduce an end-to-end solution of infrastructure, hard and soft, to be able to get the private sector to invest. So it's really about taking advantage of a kind of aggregate technology transfer type of situation where you can build skills, bring in labor, bring in marketable surplus, and hopefully have built the impetus for private sector to grow. So how do we, question number 3 to all of you, how can we solve the challenge of getting more people to have access to food in Africa? So I'd like to move on to the last section, which is the food for thought in a post-COVID Africa. These are a couple of priorities, and I'm really hoping that it leads to some thinking around research topics that may be interesting for you. Number 1, really to have a good look at African markets. With income growth, urbanization, this improving technological and logistic connectivity, it would be important to look at future-proofing the growth of African markets, and how can we both be competitive in food and niche commodities and bring the greatest value and food and nutrition security with the way that African food markets are structured. 2, the reconfiguration of global value chains. It'd be very interesting to see how COVID-19 will play out in Africa. I know that in, for example, in the US, it's playing out very much in terms of the refocus on logistics and the users and suppliers of goods and services. So it'd be very interesting to see how that impacts Africa also. The collaboration between regions, as I mentioned, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and the implementation of it is something that we are looking forward to, and some of the opportunities and challenges that come out of this regional integration. The prioritization of agro-industrialization, I mentioned that, so I won't mention it again, but just the importance of agro-industrialization as a sector that can be much more inclusive. My final slide, i.e., looking at the returns on investment in market and logistic infrastructure, because this is a big dilemma for African countries that don't have the budgets, that don't have enough infrastructure like a China or a Thailand. So there really is a need to look at returns on investment and which investment in the context of a much more digital world. conducive environments for private sector to thrive. What are the main business environment factors that are important for different efforts around entrepreneurial processes, and really making sure that we can galvanize the private sector. Finally, the financing for SMEs. I think as you noted, SMEs are incredibly important, but they're a portion of this a segment that really is very difficult to finance. So really thinking about how assistance and loans can be leveraged to help SMEs to upgrade is really important. And I think just in general, both from the policy perspective and from the private sector angle, the energy to help African agricultural transformation has to be shared. And most of these solutions are really medium to long term, and they're really hard-won economic solutions. So with that, I would like to ask you the final question. What are some research priorities that are important to you? Love to hear more about that. And I'd just like to thank you. As I mentioned in the beginning, I meet Cornell people everywhere I go in the world. And I look forward to meeting all of you somewhere in Africa soon. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Atsuko. Thank you for actually leaving time for Q&A and discussion. I know when I talked to you, Atsuko was very keen on wanting to hear the thoughts and questions from students and faculty alike. So I would like to spend the next 15 minutes opening up that discussion. So if you can raise your virtual hand, then I'll be taking in questions. And thank for everybody who is sending comments, and I will be sharing these with Atsuko after the presentation. So I'll open it up with for Q&A and discussions. I'm monitoring just raise your virtual hand. Okay, I see Steffi. Let's start with you.
Hi, Atsuko. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate you telling us a little bit more about your research, but I'm curious, it seemed like it was all a little bit more general. I'm curious about any regional trends within the continent that you could speak upon a little bit more. Do we see some growing a little bit faster towards, let's say, West Africa or South Africa, or maybe even North, actually, I mean, a little bit of everything, right? And how are they differing? How do they differ? And then maybe some of the trends that you foresee for the future.
So you want to take that? I see there's also another question, Minoj. You want to, maybe let's take two at a time.
Okay, thanks for a nice presentation. I am from Nepal. So you have been there, so I'm feeling good. So my agenda is in values and development, especially the small farmers are usually seems weaker compared to the large entrepreneur and the suppliers. And so in this situation, how the supply chain and whole value chain model can be benefited for the poor. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. So first of all, Steffi, thanks for the question, really important. And thank you for understanding that Africa is one continent, but many, many countries, and regional diversity, and so many differences. So just in terms of trends, yes, there are a number of trends. There are some countries that are more agricultural than others, and some that are more commodity driven. And I must say those that have been able to diversify have been doing better. So that includes your Senegal, your Ghana, your Rwanda, your Ethiopia. And so that's like one bucket of countries. Another bucket of countries are those that have more developed markets. So you have your Morocco's, your Egypt, your South Africa. So very, very different. And then of course there's your transition states. I actually will send you a map that our industrial team has done with regards to where you have kind of your countries that are rising very quickly, the countries that are like slow starters but rising, and then those countries where you have different buckets, and they're compared to Asia, so it makes it very interesting. So I'd like to be able to share that with you. But what's important about your question is the recognition of the differences, and I really love that. So thank you so much. And then Manoj, for your question, I think you're talking about the smallholders. Yeah, so I'm going to answer the question in two ways. Smallholders are very, very important. And of course, you know, as a development community, it's really important to integrate smallholders into the conversation. But I'm going to be a little bit provocative here also. Commercialization of agriculture does not mean that we can actually meet the needs of all smallholders. You know, when I was working in Asia, like the land plots we were working on, whether it be Nepal or Vietnam, are extremely small. But like in Vietnam, we saw like this aggregation of commodities, this aggregation of produce that made it easier to have a quality or a standard that was relatively standard. In Africa, what we're seeing is that we really need to work with commercial farmers also, i.e. those farms that are slightly larger, in order to go to economies of scale, to be able to mechanize, to be able to kind of have some sort of impact. So really, for example, when we're working with special agro-industrial processing zones, one of the questions we ask is, how many commercial farmers are there in that area? Because it's not as easy to use the supply flowing in from many smallhold farmers. So I hope I can provoke you on that answer. Thanks, Manoj.
Okay, we need more questions. I need to see, there's one hand up. Just hold on 1 second. Who is that?
It's me again, but I'll wait to see if there's any other questions.
Steffi, go ahead. Go ahead, please.
All right. I'm a huge fan. I was born and I lived in Mexico till I was 20, and so fairly developed country from the developing standpoint, right? And then I lived in Senegal for almost 4 years, and so very different agricultural processes. But I want to kind of keep exploring this small versus larger organizations push, because part of my time in Senegal was with the Peace Corps, and a huge focus is us working with small farmers, doing some sort of agro business, trying to do conservation of produce and all of these other activities, right? And it seemed like at least the organizations in Senegal, there's a bunch of them, seem to still have that small focus. Granted, this was almost 6 years ago, and so maybe that's changed, but I'm curious if you see those international development trends starting to focus on larger corporations or larger companies as well, compared to the huge focus that has been for at least the last maybe 15 years in small or micro enterprises.
You can answer that one, Atsuko. Okay, thank you so much, Steffi, and amazing that you've been in Mexico and Senegal. I'm jealous. Okay, I'm gonna provoke you on two fronts. Okay, so for me, there's two things that I always like, kind of, we get into debates about is, it's important to commercialize and see agriculture as an agribusiness, and therefore a certain level of scale is required, a certain level of productivity is required, a certain level of quality is required, and that's what we call acceleration. So I think it's extremely important. Having said that, in the development community, it's still very, very much around small, and so maybe that's not too popular of me to say, but I mean, we are talking about acceleration, and I think it's the same thing around small, medium enterprises. We put the small and the medium together. It's not. The medium-sized enterprise can absorb technologies. They've been testing and trying different technologies. They have a tried, tested track record. It's so different in terms of even the mindset, the ambition to grow. Small usually means a little bit more subsistence. Medium means let's grow, and ambition is everything in business. So I think it's a debate on the table, but I would pick the growth in order to accelerate. Thank you. I see we have questions from Angelique and Mamadou in that order.
Yeah, so earlier you had talked about like how important it is for the African countries to be able to export these agricultural products. But from what we know about like international trade and economics is that from an exporting country's standpoint is that the losers in the situations are the consumers. So these are regular people because they have to pay more for these products. do you think that, people are even financially able or ready for this huge like economic shift?
Mamadou? Mamadou, you're muted. I think you'll have to unmute.
Okay, am I on now?
Yes, you're on.
Hello, good to see you, Ed. Good to see you, Terry, and everybody who's been with for several years. A great presentation. I really enjoyed listening to this. And it's been what, 10 years that I have not been in this forum, I guess, at least. I'm very happy to join. I was happy to see, hey, Terry, there you go. You haven't changed a bit. So Atsuko, this might be a little bit out of context, but I think it may benefit the students who are taking this course, because at the end of the day, we're looking for what we can practice on the field, right? How will these things benefit? How do we make connections? I would like to encourage, before I ask my questions, any of the students here that are on this board, please. I remember a couple of 10 years ago or so, this has been the place where I made most of the connections. People who were invited by IAD to give a talk. I gave a talk there. Also, I participated to all the symposiums and everything. My best, how will I say, rate of return of reaching out to people has been through this symposium. And many of my colleagues that we met on this table, including Ed, Terry was my professor, Ed, we were a graduate student together and all that. Many of the people I'm still connected with, and I can reach out with at any time of the night. If I have a question or I need help or I can provide help, these are people who I just feel like they're family. So please take this serious. Just people sitting next to you, virtually, of course, or people that are presenting, these people are already, when they come, at the moment I was afraid, but when they come to this meeting, they are already ready. They know they're looking for next talent, new people, how they can help, how they can orient people. So anyway, my question is, please, it might be out of context, and it's totally fine if you don't want to answer it, or if any of the moderator don't like to be addressed. But can you, in all your experience, tell me what has been, how have you supported farmers or institutions financially or with technically or whatever, any of your experience that has been the most rewarding for yourself?
It's a good question. And that's so, guys, you're taking that in winding down as well. Maybe you can also insert what things, skills, so your profession has been so wide and broad. What skill you think you wish you could pick as a student that could carry you through into this kind of world? So over to you, Atsuko.
Okay, thanks a lot. First of all, let me try to answer Angelique's question. I think it's really, really important to take it from the perspective of the consumer and from the perspective of demand. I think too many times we think about what we can supply and how to supply that, but it's actually about the demand and what the consumer can afford. So I really love the question. And I think the problem here in Africa after COVID or during COVID was the fact that the economic measures was actually decreasing the purchasing power of the consumer. So, you know, that's the most important thing. And I think your perspective is so important, i.e., how can we make sure food is affordable? And this was the whole conversation, i.e., how do we actually make more food accessible? It's and nutritious food. So I think let me leave you with that question. And I know that we're short on time, but Mamadou, you've waited for 10 years to come back to this platform. I feel like the pressure is on. I'll ask Terry and Louise whether they want to answer the question. But so for me, my most amazing moment was actually, so I moved from Vietnam to Nigeria. And so I always tell people I was born in Japan, but I grew up in Nigeria. Like everything I could do, it did not work in Nigeria. So like I tried, like there was no relationship between the effort that I would put into processing a project or pushing with the ministries to try to get something done. It was almost like disassociated between effort and result. And that was the greatest lesson in life, because unless one actually steps back, listens, and adapts to the practices in that country, it's just not possible to get things done. And so I think for me, that was the greatest skill that I acquired to be able to do the work that I do now in development. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Atsuko. I think we're up to our time. I would ask students, people, if you can unmute yourself or show your camera so we can give a big round of thank you to Atsuko Toda. Arigato.
Arigato. Thank you so much. And
Thank you so
for the
much.
Ed, Terry, Louise, thank you very much. And
Pleasure.
to all the students around, really, we look forward to seeing you in Africa. All the very best.